Oh, hello everybody. Thanks for joining me on the channel here. I really appreciate it. We have why Europe is insanely well designed. And sometimes I forget about how, you know, Canada, you could fit the entirety of Europe inside Canada. Inside Canada. Is that crazy? And you could drive, partway through Ontario. And in Europe, you've gone from Greece all the way to Iraq. But in Canada, you're still driving around in Ontario. It's crazy. I say it's really crazy. Let's check this out, though. It is insane. And we do have really, really poorly planned cities. Poorly planned cities, poorly planned walkability, poorly planned, just poorly planned cities. Yeah, the city planning is atrocious. It's a different plate of fish over there in Europe, and Canada and the United States. A leopard can't change its dots, right? So I don't really know. It's the writing's on the stall for Canadian and American cities. Like, you need to have a vehicle and you need to drive copious amounts of time to get groceries, go to work, and there's no workable transit unless you're in one of like four Canadian cities. And this is coming from a Canadian's perspective. We have like Vancouver on the west coast, Calgary and Edmonton, and then the entire prairies is like empty. There is a few cities, like there's a couple cities here and there. There's Winnipeg, Manitoba, but nobody wants to live in Winnipeg, and it's not like a. And then you get all the way over to Ontario. You have Canada's like center of the universe. Even like non-hockey fans have probably heard of the Toronto Maple Leafs. You have Toronto and the Toronto metropolitan area. Then you have Montreal and Quebec in Quebec. And that's pretty much it. And you go over on the East Coast, you have like Halifax, and there's a very, very small population. Also, I believe 95% of Canada's population lives within 25 kilometers of the American border. Something crazy like that. So even where I live right now, I used to live in Vancouver, but where I live right now, it's still very close to the American border, probably maybe 150 kilometers away, 100 kilometers away from the American border, something like that. But yeah, why Europe is insanely well designed. Let's check it out.
This is a map of Europe's mass transit railway system across 33 countries. The yellow lines indicate the presence of a train line, and as you can see, it's very dense. There are hardly any spaces where there isn't any coverage for railways. Now, if we compare this to a map of railroad tracks in the US, it's a different story. While parts of the US have some good mass transit, there are large areas of the country which isn't covered by Amtrak, the nation's largest passenger railroad service. But let me show you another map, this time of high-speed rail in Europe. Now obviously, high-speed railways aren't going to be as common as regular speed railways, as they require excellent design, strict planning, and massive investment. And yet, as we can see, high-speed rail is present in Europe, which is a stark contrast to the US, as you can see from this map. While the US does have some higher speed rail, like the Aquila line in the Northeastern Corridor, it's hardly an effective map of transport solutions. And the Aquila line isn't really that fast either. It can reach about 150 miles per hour, but averages less than 70. This is not the case for Europe's insanely well-designed railroad system. And you have to remember that Europe's system accomplishes this while spanning 33 different nations in a very diverse continent. And I know what you're probably thinking. This is just because Europe is smaller than the United States, which simply isn't true. While the European Union is smaller than the US,
Yeah, it really doesn't matter like if you have a smaller landmass, if you haven't put in the effort and if you don't have the infrastructure there for efficient and effective transportation. That's your country's leaders' problems. Canada is huge. I believe we're in the top 3. I should know this, but we have an enormous landmass and we should have better I think it's more of a population thing, at least in Canada, because our population is still very small. And some of our big cities, they do have good transit systems. Like Vancouver has got a pretty excellent transit system. It's not bad anyways. Toronto's pretty good, and like the big cities have it. But if you're not in one of the big cities, you're basically screwed. You have no choice but to have a vehicle and drive everywhere. But even having a train, and we do have trains that go from Vancouver to Calgary and all the way across the prairies, but I believe they're super expensive. They're not economically viable they're more of like a vacation thing than like viable transportation. And then air travel, we all know, is very expensive as well. So it's just poorly designed, and our land mass is too enormous and population is too small.
Continental Europe has an area that is about 1.04 times as much as the US. So we can dismiss this argument that the United States can't be that well designed because it's too big. Europe simply is better designed. But if you're American, you might not understand why railroad tracks or public transport as a whole is so important. I mean, driving a car works fine, right? Well, no. And Europe showcases why a primary focus on private transportation is so detrimental to a well-functioning transit system. Look at these maps. They show the US road network versus the EU's. And as you can see, the EU's road network is not nearly as impressive as the US's. And yet, when you look at some of the most congested cities in the world, European countries don't feature particularly prominently in the global rankings. This is pretty shocking information because you'd assume that the country with a more expansive road network has a lot less congestion, especially considering the United States has devoted lots of time and money to their highways. So how come Europe is less congested when they have fewer
everybody
roads?
Wants
well,
to drive a
it all comes
vehicle
down
in
to disincentivizing the
North
use of cars and, most importantly, making an attractive alternative. Europe does this by having both private and public
Attractive
transportation infrastructure,
alternatives, yeah.
which technically the US has as well, it's just a lot worse. But on top of this, Europe makes it pretty...
That's definitely the key. Anytime that I'm sitting in traffic and I'm looking around to me, and you have all of these people just driving their little vehicle singularly, like just them in like a 5-person vehicle, 5-person seat vehicle. And really, it does not make sense. If there's, God forbid, there's an accident or something and everybody's sitting in traffic for hours, and humans, as much as we purport to be innovative and technologically advancing, our travel systems in North America are still, by a country's smile, way worse than what they have in Europe. Also, walkability within cities is way, way better in Europe. Actually, like livability, quality of life. Yeah, why do I still live here? But the road less unraveled is not always right, so.
Pretty expensive to buy, own and use a car. This is achieved by having high taxes on vehicles and gasoline. In fact, here's a map of worldwide gasoline prices. As you can see, European nations are in the top rankings, while the US lies at the bottom, charging very little. But let me be very clear, it's only a good idea to make it expensive to drive a car if you have an attractive alternative, which America doesn't, but Europe does. I mean, obviously this wouldn't work in the US with its current transportation infrastructure, but in Europe, this is a great strategy because you make the roads less congested for those who actually need them and give everyone else an affordable and efficient alternative, being Europe's
bicycles.
Amazing public transport like the trains on the railways. This is arguably the better strategy because even though the vast majority of Americans have access to vehicles at around 91% and gas is comparatively cheap, it still leaves 9% who don't have access to vehicles. What are these people who can't afford a car supposed to do? I mean, sometimes public transport isn't even an option or simply too expensive for many. So you've now actively excluded those who aren't exactly the most well off from society. To make matters worse, some US cities actually got rid of their public transport to make room for more cars. I'm not joking. American streetcars like trams were actually removed to make way for bigger roads. Absolutely insane. Compare that to Oslo, Berlin and Madrid, where discussions are underway to restrict or even exclude most cars from the city center. And let's not forget that when you have cars, you also need somewhere to park them. And this is where things start to become rather ridiculous. You see, the United States has...
That's where in the US and Canada we have these strip malls, and they're just large swaths of land which are totally ugly. The infrastructure is totally an eyesore, and it's just parking lots and Walmarts, parking lots and Walmarts.
has 2
Great.
billion parking spaces for 250 million cars. That's 8 parking spaces per vehicle. In Europe, it's pretty much a 1-to-1 with around 250 million public parking spaces for 300 million cars. But to emphasize the ridiculousness of this even further, the area that the US dedicates for car parking is actually larger than the area dedicated for housing people. It's honestly unbelievable that people are being squeezed out of American cities due to regulators wanting to make more room for parking spaces. This simply wouldn't fly in the EU, as it has a whole policy dedicated to improving urban planning. See, the EU
See, urban planning, it's a huge problem here.
spent 115 billion euros between
And
2014
I really commend these beautiful European cities with their trees and the ability to walk to work, the ability to walk to the corner grocery store. You also need to have city planners that understand that mixed use planning can have beneficial means as well. At least in Canada, mainly you won't have mixed use. You'll have residential area, which will be a large area. It's just residential. And then, so you can't walk anywhere because, say your house is in the middle of the residential area, which is quite large. Say it takes 10 minutes to drive out of there. So you can't walk. It's going to take you an hour to drive out of there. You can't walk to the grocery store and walk back home. It's impossible. So I think improving and adding more mixed-use areas will only improve, it'll stimulate economic development and people spending, and it'll limit the use of vehicles. But everything's just so spread out that it's just so hard to change now. And the infrastructure is so entrenched with driving automobiles that it's, I don't know. So Europe, they got it.
and 2020 to improve city design by making it smarter, greener, and more connected. Simply meaning they allocated funds to make their cities more efficient, more connected, and better for the environment. And better for the environment they really are, as the average resident in a typical Western US city, such as Los Angeles or Phoenix, contributes approximately 6 times more carbon to the atmosphere per capita than an average European city resident. This is purely the result of not having effective transport solutions, which saves resources and allows people to move about efficiently. And exactly that, moving about efficiently, is something most of Europe's citizens are able to do as a result of the European Union. See, most of Europe's nations are in the European Union, which gives the EU citizens
the boogeyman, the European Union, World Economic Forum as well. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy.
a number of perks, which include
What's his name? Klaus Schwab, the Dr. Evil-like figure, the leader of the WEF, who he's a particular target, let's say, of conspiracy theorists and conservatives, I guess. Are they Machiavellian and mischievous, evil people trying to control the world? Maybe. I don't know.
includes a free travel area. This has been one of the most important achievements of the EU, as it makes it possible for an EU citizen to travel freely to other EU member states and stay for up to 3 months. All they need is a passport or even just an ID card. No visas, no trips to embassies, no form filing, just head straight over. This makes it incredibly easy to travel, study, and work in other countries and communities, and having this level of centralization is very important to good design, as it gives the smartest people the opportunity to work where they are most useful. And since good design obviously requires a lot of complicated problem solving and planning, this is very smart. Another smart thing is the incredible biking infrastructure we see in Europe, perfectly illustrated by this map of bike path density in Europe. All the purple lines are bike paths, and there's clearly a lot of them, especially towards the left side of the map, but that's just because this is the home of the Dutch, the Netherlands. Now, the funny thing is, I won't be able to compare this to a map of bike path density in the United States, because such a map hasn't been made. At least I wasn't able to find any, and I can only wonder why. But anyway, what Europe and also the European Union has achieved is pretty...
People have a disdain for cyclists in North America, I find, at least from my anecdotal experience, they have a certain disdain and hatred for bicyclists. They they get schadenfreude when they see a bicyclist get, hit by a vehicle. It's insane. Whereas we should have, or be working towards, efficient and beautiful and nature inclusive bicycle paths all around our cities, but they're gray and infrastructurally ugly.
Remarkable, as it's hard to think of another set of such diverse countries where you would be able to travel so freely, in an efficient and inexpensive manner. I mean, you can literally get from Paris to Amsterdam, for example, in just 3 hours for around $30. Imagine being able to travel all over Asia without any border crossings, checks or visas, and being able to stay for months at a time. That would be truly amazing. And let's not forget that European design has always been distinctive and very successful. In fact, the continent's history of design and interconnectedness serves as a model for the rest of the world. But even though Europe and the EU are pretty great and have amazing infrastructure, they obviously aren't perfect. And I'd love to hear some of the reasons it might not be, so leave a comment down below if you have some thoughts on this. But that's it for this video, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.
Alright, excellent video, informative, beautiful, loved it. Alright, let me know, I know there's positives and negatives to Europe and to North America. And there's so many North American things that are ridiculous. Yeah. Fast food and fast food cigarettes, shopping malls. We got everything you need. All right, later on.